Hello, my name is James Davis and welcome to my lecture entitled The Right to Pioneer Kentucky, developed for an undergraduate class on Kentucky history. Today I'm going to introduce the lengthy history of Kentucky to you and evaluate whether or not pioneers should have ventured into the Kentucky wilderness in the first place. You'll notice that I have a Native American backdrop behind me as well as a Canadian tie, and that is because Kentucky is steeped in both Native American and Canadian history, as we will discuss. In this lecture, we are going to talk about some of the early tribes that occupied its territory, some of its major historical actors who went out to shape this state, and discuss some historic battles that took place to both found this country and galvanize us as a union. To understand Kentucky, we need to first understand that it existed as a larger part of Virginia, which was previously known as Kentucke County. It is home to the western portion of the Appalachian Mountains, enriched with minerals and raw material. It has a rolling hill in the central region, known for its fertile soil. And lastly, a flat western portion of the state. Kentucky is separated by the Ohio River to the north, and the Big Sandy River on its eastern side. The state was home to several Native Americans, including the Shawnee, the Cherokee, and the Chickasaw, to name but a few. These tribes not only occupied the region, but played a major role in what would come, as they would go on to ally and participate in the French and Indian War, the American Revolution, and the War of 1812. The mountainous terrain and farmable land within, which would become known as the Bluegrass region of the state, was already occupied when these European pioneers made their way into the interior of the country. This clash between the pioneers and the indigenous peoples would continue, eventually impacting how wars were fought between the British and the Americans. Shifting our attention to the indigenous civilizations in Kentucky, let's first look to the Shawnee's territory, which stretched from the most eastern border of Kentucky all the way to the westernmost border in Louisville. This tribe is notable for an Indian war chief named Tecumseh, who participated in the War of 1812. They were nomadic in their movements and occupied dwellings called wigwam. They could be found on riverfronts across the Mississippi and Ohio rivers. Shifting to the next tribe, the Chickasaw tribe occupied southwest Kentucky, around what is known as Daviess County now. The Chickasaw have a number of famous people to include John Harrington, an astronaut, but are most accurately represented by their last hereditary leader, Teshominko, who also participated in the War of 1812. The Chickasaw were a semi-nomadic people. Turning our attention to another tribe, the Yuki people existed near Wayne County and are represented by Timpuchi Bernard. Not much is known about them as their population dwindled substantially. Today they exist in Sapulpa, Oklahoma, which is right on the outskirts of Tulsa, Oklahoma. The last tribe is the Cherokee, who were originally a nomadic group but later went on to be an agricultural tribe. They exist on the southeastern corner of Kentucky in what is present-day Bell County. Their most prominent member is John Ross, who is known to have led the tribe through their transition as they were relocated to Oklahoma. Like the Cherokee, all Native Americans were forced to relocate from Kentucky to Indian Territory, which is present-day Oklahoma. The forced relocation of these tribes occurred due in large part to territorial disputes and hostilities between the pioneers and the various groups, as well as in how these tribal leaders allied themselves in various conflicts, with Tecumseh most notably, who would go on to side with the British during the War of 1812. As the colonies grew, more pioneers began to encroach into the wilderness of Kentucky County. The first pioneer to venture into the Kentucky wilderness was Dr. Thomas Walker. Walker was born in 1715 in Virginia and would marry Mildred Thornton in 1741, gaining an inheritance of her estate. Walker became a close friend of Thomas Jefferson's father and became fascinated with surveying. This fascination led him to become employed by the Loyal Land Company of Virginia. after which he ventured off into the Kentucky wilderness. His party would go through the Cumberland Gap, but did not venture far enough to locate the fertile bluegrass region, eventually deciding to turn around with no intent of returning. Daniel Boone, however, would later take up this task and follow a similar route through the Cumberland Gap, and would make multiple trips there, losing some of his children and rescuing others from an indigenous interactions. He would go on to establish Boonesboro, which later became Boone Station. This station and others would become vital to the pioneering days of Kentucky and the establishment of the state. The war with Great Britain was not over, and so the internment of sailors began by British vessels that both violated our shores and armies that violated our national borders. Soon the incursions broke out into an all-out war, with Henry Clay, a prominent Kentuckian and war hawk, seeking to go to war with Canada. It can be justifiably argued that perhaps war may have never begun if Clay and his associates had been quelled in the Congress. The inhabitants of Kentucky, however, provided a huge upside during the War of 1812, as it became a manufacturer of ammunition, with 3 gunpowder mills opening and distributing product to the military. Kentucky merchants also served as middlemen and kept the supply routes lubricated and running well in the early part of the 19th century. This allowed a manufacturing economy in the East to continue, as it had a customer base in the southern states, and Kentucky provided the necessary upkeep for the trade routes. Kentucky also supplied the necessary metal to the military during the War of 1812 via its ironworks. This necessary trade aided the country in fighting off the British. The ironworks supplied a necessary job of taking raw iron and smelting it into cannonballs, among other objects, to aid in the war effort. Animal life was and still is abundant, as well as the amount of game, wild game, worthy of hunting. A number of now extinct or near extinct animals existed in Kentucky, to include the stag moose, the gray wolf, the red wolf, black bears, and the American bison. Deer and other small game provided the eastern population with skins and pelts, while feeding the population with nutritious venison. Turning our attention to the bison for a moment, we need to remember how iconic this animal is to Native American culture, but is usually imaged in Western imagery. Bison used to roam all over Kentucky, and were so numbered that the hunters, even to the late 1790s, were out hunting bison, not deer or bulls, when they were attacked at Baker Station in 1791. The black bear is a mammal known to the Pennsylvania region, and is so prevalent in the state that it receives its own day of hunting still to today. But the black bear is also still in Kentucky, although in dwindling numbers. The black bear used to be prevalent in Kentucky, but was over-harvested at the end of the 19th century. These animals, along with many others, were extirpated in the early days of settling, along with many others that were already extinct. Lastly, before venturing away from this topic, it is important to identify how important water resources were in Kentucky. Indigenous pioneers and animals alike would seek out sources of water, and the bison were prevalent for seeking out bodies of water called licks. Anyone who pulls up Google Maps today will find streets and ponds all across the bluegrass region of Kentucky with the name lick in it. The lick is so named for the various bodies of water having a high salt concentration, making it more desirable to the animals. Salt, being an essential nutrient for the pioneers, was highly sought after, and as Kentucky neared the end of the 18th century, it would create a monopoly on salt manufacturing, with Daniel Boone helping to establish one of the first salt makers in the area, providing relief to the lower portion of Blue Licks in the winter of 1778. While there is an argument to be made that these tribes would have not had a reason to ally with the British had we not gone into their territory in the first place, it should be noted that the pioneers who did venture into the interior opened up a huge salt industry, gave rise to an entire agricultural industry, which was shipped both to the east and to the south. in addition to turning the state into a massive trade route for Eastern manufacturing. According to Elizabeth Parr, Kentucky became the junction for transport of goods and arms, shipping both food and gunpowder, first to Maryland and Philadelphia, and then the surrounding areas. But after 1802, it also opened up transportation routes to the Carolinas, the Mississippi, the Georgia, and the surrounding states. Kentucky would later serve as a landing zone for several pioneer families who would venture out even further into the interior of the nation to occupy present-day Missouri, Arkansas, and even Oklahoma. It is unlikely that without Kentuckian support, the War of 1812 would not have been so well furnished with arms and ammunition. It would have lacked the military gunpowder that Kentucky provided, and trade routes would have been non-existent without an 18th century Kentucky. What are your thoughts? What do you feel? Should the pioneers have ventured into Kentucky, or should we have left it alone? Thank you for attending my lecture.